I became involved in Event Horizon when I was contacted by Paul Anderson, and he had a script at that point, but not a lot else. And it was very loose, the script at that point. And we had a meeting, we got together and had a meeting, and it was a kind of, I think he'd seen Hellraiser and spoken to Clive about a couple of things, and he was enthusiastic for us to get involved in some of the more deaths and some of the more complicated gigs on it. So we got on very well, hit it off well, and then we started the script. There was as I remember, there was quite a gap then, and then the script suddenly came back, and everything was suddenly going. So it was a sort of, from a long time talking about it, we were then suddenly involved in shooting, and it was all systems go.
We had a brief from Paul Anderson our main one was to construct something or give the image of Sam Neill when he becomes, it's hard to describe because everyone calls it the Werebeast, but I'm not sure that was ever the right name. I know everyone calls it that, but it was more the dark side of Sam, really. He had to have carved things into his face that we don't understand, into his whole body. And I think that was just the bad bit of Sam coming out. He was taken over, who knows, he's the devil. No one's ever understood, but we had to give a visual. Prosthetics are really what you stick onto an actor. So it's a thin appliance. You take the life cast of the actor's face, and then you'd sculpt on top of that an appliance that would be stuck on top. That's called a prosthetic. It really comes from a war term from World War II, or World War I, in fact, which was where they had to make fake noses and things like that when people got blown away. So that became a prosthetic, and it's grown out of that. Well, when we start designing a full body prosthetic and designing a character like the Werebeast, for a start, we have to take on board Paul, or the director Paul Anderson's ideas, and Sam Neill, the actor, who of course is such an important guy. You know, he knows what he wants as well. You get a combination of what they feel the character should look like, and then you design, you do a series of maquettes, a series of images. I mean, Paul very strongly knew that Sam had to incise these sigils and marks and runes over his face, carve them into his flesh. Great idea. And he didn't want to see seams, and he didn't want to see edges. This had to be believable, close up, really tight as flesh on this guy's face with just these marks. So we start off and we sculpt a whole load of different maquettes. We prefer not to do drawings. Drawings 2D, you can do a quick sketch, but until you can see something in a three-dimensional form, then everyone can walk around and go, oh yeah, that's cool, that looks nice at this angle. So we do a load of maquettes first, and then we start into the major process of life casting and sculpting.
The scene in which he's in the chamber and his veins are literally popping out of his arm, that was horrific to shoot. That was really complicated to make that realistic, and we shot a lot of it in camera with makeup, and then we CG enhanced it, which is why I think it's quite an effective sequence.
Oh my God. Animatronics are completely different to prosthetics. What they are is when you don't have an actor involved and you have a mechanical puppet or a mechanical device inside something that's usually inanimate, which then has to be controlled from the outside, either by radio control or cables or pneumatics or things like that. We had quite a few animatronics in Event Horizon. We had the Burning Man, so underneath all that he was a bit like a rod puppet which all burnt, and we also had a really cool animatronic for where one of the leads falls and slams down, which had a little kicking motion and everything else in it. So animatronics are when you don't have people inside, prosthetics are when you've got actors inside them.
So we're doing a full body, when we're dealing with head to foot prosthetics, first of all, it's a full body life cast in separate sections. So we do the head first, because the head is going to have to be worked on many times in the future, you know, for the close-up facial prosthetics. Then, depending on the body position, standing, you do the body in, you might do separate arms, you might do the torso separately from the waist down to the legs, and all these components. It can take up to 6-7 hours for body cast sections, which is crippling for the actor and for the people who are working on it. So you get plaster positives out. So you've got Sam Neill in pure white plaster. And then it's lots of moulds, lots of different sections that we can cast, we can work on, sculpt, remold. Oh, process is endless.
There was a lot of scenes that from the film that required prosthetics. There were, for us, one of the major ones was a big nightmare sequence, which is the videotapes that reflected back to the people who were the original crew, and there was a lot of prosthetics in that. Sometimes it was you got blood and guts gore with insides torn out and eyeballs missing and severed limbs and all that kind of stuff. There was also some complicated prosthetics on the character that gets frozen when it tries to commit suicide by opening the outer hatch, and he actually ends up tumbling outside and freezing up. There was a lot of complicated prosthetics on that, which had to. Some of them were on the wrists, which had to bubble up, but also we had complicated prosthetics on the face that were all had to crack and revealed the cracks underneath. Quite a lot of different. I'm trying to think what else there was on it. Other prosthetics. Lots of blood and guts. I mean, there was just lots of your normal guts and gag like that, and tons of blood. I mean, there was so much blood. But I think probably for a 30-second sequence, that was the sort of montage of stuff that takes place in the video that they watch. There was a week's shooting and probably about 4 or 5 weeks worth of prep, just all the different gags and everything else.
We worked on a lot of other scenes. Jason Isaacs was disemboweled beautifully, we felt. That was quite a religious scene, that, you know, with the old arms outstretched. And I'm not quite sure if you saw all the beautiful guts that we made lying on the table in front of him, but they were gorgeous, and all the flesh was backlit. I mean, Jason Isaacs is awesome as well. I mean, he had another full body life cast, and in a crippling position. He was standing there and he was refusing, and his arms were shaking, but he did it. I mean, he gritted his teeth, he wouldn't give up. He's a fantastic guy.
What you have is a set of teeth which the actor would have worn, and they operate it with their tongue underneath. But this was for someone was like knocking a hammer into the back of someone's head, and then we had to have the tooth be knocked out, blood and guts, everything else. Tiny gag, you know, there's a few days' work in just that alone, and it's probably on the screen for less than 2 seconds, 3 seconds. So there was tons of those little tiny gags, which really made up that prosthetic side of things, and really gave moments. But I think it's how they use those moments that count. It may only be 2 seconds, but when they're coming at you, it really does sort of pound the senses. The animatronic side of the film was more to do with things like we had to have a release mechanism for the frozen man to bring it down to actually drop it at exactly the right angle. Paul wanted it to be like a chimney collapsing, so it had to come into the ground and then completely crunch up as it went. So that needed a rig to drop that. There was a burning man, which was an optical technique, which was really sort of something that pushed out the limits a little bit, which was to do with us doing a rod puppet with layers of burning layers, which they'd use for matting and optically put on. So that was another animatronic. And there was the falling rig, which was a great rig for one of the characters had to fall from the top of a really high site and then fall down and smash into the floor, and that was done with an animatronic dummy as well. But I think by far the most complex effect in the film was probably the burning man, because it was made up of so many different layers and so many different techniques. When we finished with it, we were supplying optical elements for them to use later on, but we had to have a material that would burn and deteriorate like flesh and burn onto the next layer and could be done over and over again. I think we shot that for about 8-9 days, that sequence of the optical elements of that. So incredibly complex piece just by itself. Event Horizon had lots of complicated effects because we were trying to push the envelope and really reach out there and get something that the audience hadn't seen before, and something that would really take us to a different place. So I think we were always trying to be very complex effects, very difficult effects, and something you hadn't seen. And I think that's always the hardest effects you can try and do.